So without much delay, I'm going to hand it over to Bjarte.
Thank you. I hope you do that when I'm finished as well. So, it's great to be back, and a bit sad as well, since it's the last time, but again, thank you very much for the invitation. I don't know how much you've heard about Beyond Budgeting before. You might have heard me speak before, but Beyond Budgeting is about much more than budgets. It's about business agility. And let me make it clear already from the start. There can be no true agile transformation, no scaling of agile, no business agility without Beyond Budgeting. And what I'm saying now is no criticism of agile. I'm a big fan. I've been here since day one. But agile was not invented, designed as a way to run an enterprise. It was born in software development to help improve software development and how teams worked, and it did wonders. But when you try to scale agile, the holes in agile become visible. All the stuff that executives want to know, how will this work in this new reality? And the Agile Manifesto don't have most of those answers Beyond Budgeting has. And I'd like to start with a quote from a wise person, one of the pioneers in Beyond Budgeting. He's passed on, but he was the CEO of a large Scandinavian bank. He said a lot of wise things, including this. And this bank, as I will come back to, has been operating without budgets, targets, individual bonus since 1970, with fantastic results. Great man, great company. When I'm out talking about Beyond Budgeting with executives, finance people, others, there's one word that keeps coming up over and over again, and that is the word control. Right? And the context is, of course, the fear of losing control. Right? And when I have these discussions, I always ask these people, what do you mean with this word control? And the interesting thing is that after people have said cost control, many go quiet. They struggle with defining what they mean. So I checked up in Oxford Dictionary, how do they define control? And they call it the power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events. And what does this mean in organizational terms, in business terms? Well, it actually means two things, controlling people and controlling the future. And behind these two lies the two main assumptions behind traditional management. Number one, you can't trust people. Number two, the future is predictable and plannable. And you know as well as I that that is not true. These are more illusions of control. Of course you can manage people, but if people are managed in stupid ways, they hopefully find a way around in order to get their job done. And when it comes to the future, the only thing we know is that we don't know. And today, that is more true than ever. So this is, in a way, a paradox. Executives so afraid of losing something, that is actually just an illusion of control. It's a paradox. There's another paradox that we need to talk about. It's around innovation. Because everybody loves innovation, right? Everybody wants to be leading edge, unique, right on the forefront, better than everybody else. All of you guys are working with innovation. But that enthusiasm for innovation seems to be limited to technology innovation, into products and services and so on. But there is also something called management innovation that I'm going to talk about today. That is about exploring new ways of leading and managing. And management innovation, is that great? Uh-oh, that is scary. Kicking out a budget, are you crazy? The consequence is that it's very crowded over here. Everybody is into that innovation in some form or shape. While this is not yet a crowded place because it's scary. But that is actually good news for brave companies who dare to explore and embrace also this kind of innovation, because you can get just as much performance, competitive advantage out of management innovation as you can get from technology innovation. Wallander, the guy we saw on the first slide, he was very open. My bank has no advantage whatsoever in the kind of products and services we provide. We find it in the way we lead and manage. So, It's all about performance, right? Better performance, competitive advantage. That is why we should go beyond budgeting, because it is good for performance, defined in the right way. So I'm going to come back to that important word, performance, but it is still called beyond budgeting. So, of course, it has something to do with budgets as well. And when I say budgets, you need to think about the broad definition, not just project budgets and cost budgets that you might be most kind of familiar with. The broader finance definition includes the revenue sales budgets, investment budgets, and so on and so on. So think about this as the broad definition. And I would like to share with you some of the problems with this way of managing, this way of leading and thinking. And that is a long list. Very time-consuming, making problems, following up, making budgets, following up budgets, takes a lot of time. Assumptions quickly outdated. For many companies, the budget assumptions they have based the entire budget on is outdated already before the year has started. This is a serious problem. Budgeting can stimulate what I would call unethical behaviors. The lowballing, the gaming, the sandbagging, the resource hoarding, that frenzy December spending, these are not the kind of behaviors that we would like to see between colleagues. Right? At the same time, I'm not blaming anyone for behaving like this, because these people are just responding to the system that we have designed for them to operate within. So if we want to change behaviors, as you probably know, it's not about fixing people, it's about fixing systems, which again changes behavior, which is exactly what beyond budgeting is doing. It can create these illusions of control. Of course, it might feel very comfortable to have next year described with 1 million details and decimals, but again, the only thing we know is that we don't. It forces us to make decisions too early. We have to decide in the autumn the year before. What shall we do next year? What it shall cost? And in larger organizations, too many of these decisions are taken too high up. That doesn't always improve the quality of these decisions, because that is not necessarily where the best information is sitting, as you all know. Budgets can prevent us from doing stuff that we should have done, right? We should have done it, but we can't, because it's not in the budget. But this also works the other way around. It can sometimes lead us to do things that we shouldn't have done, but it is in the budget and it is spend it or lose it. I think you know the game. And linked to this, I fully accept that a cost budget can be a very effective ceiling on cost, capping cost. It does work generally, but that is just half the story, because that ceiling is just effective as a floor, in the sense that these budgets tend to be spent even if they shouldn't. And to define good performance as hitting the budget numbers is a very narrow, mechanical, and sometimes quite an outdated way of defining good performance. We need a richer, broader, more intelligent performance language. Are there any of these problems that you haven't experienced throughout your own career and in the organizations you have worked for? No hands up, and I'm not surprised. I've been asking that question to hundreds of thousands of people around the world in the 30 years that I've been working with Beyond Budgeting. And most people out there agree. Executives, finance people, others, they all agree. A lot of nodding heads and guilty smiles when this list is coming up. At the same time, most organizations continue doing stuff they admit is a bit stupid. And I have an idea about why. But before that, I've got one more problem on my list that very few think about. I've called it conflicting purposes. I'll come back to that problem. It's an interesting problem because it's both a problem, but it also represents solutions to many of these other problems. But again, how come many continue doing this stuff? One reason could be that they recognize these problems, but they are seen more like irritating itches, and not symptoms of a deeper, bigger, more systemic problem. But that is exactly what these problems are. Symptoms of a huge problem, which is also, again, a paradox. Because what we are looking at here is actually quite old management technology. In case you don't know, this stuff is around 100 years old. And the guy who invented this stuff, his name was James O. McKinsey, the founder of McKinsey Consulting. I never met the guy, but actually, I don't think he was an evil guy. I actually think he had the best of intentions. He wanted to help organizations perform better. This was management innovation 100 years ago. And I'm sure it worked pretty well back then, maybe even 50 years ago. But today, this way of thinking, this way of leading, this way of managing is doing exactly the opposite. It has become more of a barrier than a support for getting out the best possible performance. And that, my friends, I would call a pretty big problem. Now, how can we solve these problems? Well, there is two ways. You can go straight for the bigger beyond budgeting model that I will come back to in a minute, or you can start a bit more safe, in a bit safer place, linked to this last problem, conflicting purposes. Because if we ask ourselves, why do companies and organizations make budgets? And again, think about that broad definition. Then most people will come up with three different reasons. Companies make budgets to set targets. Financial targets, sales targets, production targets. That's one purpose. The second purpose is that I want to understand what next year could look like in terms of profits, cash flow, and so on. So it's a kind of forecast of what next year could look like. And the third purpose is resource allocation, handing out bags of money to the organization on operational cost and investment projects. And it might seem very efficient to solve three purposes in one process and one set of numbers, which Beyond Budgeting is doing. But that's exactly the problem. Because what happens when we move into a budget process, and again, let's assume that upstairs, finance, they want to understand what could next year look like in terms of profits. So they start by asking people responsible on the revenue sales side, what are your best numbers for next year? But everybody knows that the numbers I'm sending upstairs now on sales, those numbers will come back to me as a target for next year, maybe with a bonus attached to it. And we all know what that insight might do to the level of numbers submitted. They will start to move this way because everybody wants to hit their targets. Then we move to the cost side. Same people, other people are asked, what are your best numbers for next year? But everybody knows that this is my only chance of getting access to resources for next year. And maybe some remember that 20% cut from last year. And that insight and that memory might also do something to the level of numbers submitted. And this time the numbers goes the other way, right? And I see a few smiling faces here, so I think you know what I'm talking about. And again, this is the problem, not just because it destroys the quality of numbers, but even more because it stimulates this behavior that is at least borderline unethical. But again, it's not about fixing people, it's about fixing systems. And that is what Beyond Budgeting do. This is a very simple fix. We are simply separating these three different purposes into three different processes, because these are different things. A target is an aspiration. It's what we want to happen. While a forecast is an expectation. It's what we think will happen. Whether we like what we see or not. Brutally honest. And last but not least, resource allocation. That is about the optimization of scarce resources. And when we have separated, then we can, for instance, allow targets to be more ambitious than forecasts. But this is just a kind of intermediate step. The main purpose of the separation is to allow for improvement of each of the three. Because now we can start to have great discussions about how can we set better targets that really kind of stretch us without feeling stretched. How can we get the gaming and the play and all the unethical behaviors out of the forecasting so that we know that we can trust the numbers? And last but not least, how can we find more intelligent ways of managing cost than what Mr. McKinsey could offer us 100 years ago? And finally, having separated, we can organize each of the three on a rhythm, a cadence that better reflect not just the kind of business we are in, but also each purpose. So we can make all of this more event-driven, more business-driven, and less calendar-driven. Now, in having these discussions about how to improve, we need inspiration. And that inspiration we can find in the beyond budgeting principles. And I want to show the full model for you now. But before I do that, this is an important slide, because if someone tells me that it's impossible to operate without the budget, my simple answer is, well, here we still do what that budget tried to do for us, right? But because we've separated, we can do each one in much, much better ways. And by the way, this is not 3 times more work. Maybe it's not necessarily a lot less work, but it's much more continuous, much more forward-looking, much more business-oriented. So it's a better way of spending our times. But where can we find the inspiration? We can find it in the beyond budgeting principles. And what you see on the beyond budgeting principles addresses both leadership and management processes. And then we need to go back to those 2 assumptions behind traditional management. Number 1, you can't trust people. Well, we are challenging that in the beyond budgeting leadership principles around many things, but especially here around autonomy. And when it comes to the future being unpredictable and unplannable, that is something that we are relating to on the right-hand side. So here are the 3 first purposes that I mentioned on the previous slide, and then follow up. Then the next one is about performance evaluation, which is a kind of subset of this one. The last one is, and then we have one about rewards linked to performance evaluation, also a subset of targets. And last but not least, we are addressing the rhythm of all these processes. So the inspiration for the improvement should come partly from looking at the leadership principles. How do we need to design our management processes so that they are more kind of purpose-oriented, values, transparency-oriented, autonomy-oriented, and so on. The second inspiration should come from looking at our business environment, looking at all the uncertainty, complexity, volatility, and uncertainty out there. What does that mean for the design of our management processes? So one external inspiration around people and employees. What do we believe about our employees? And the second inspiration being external, coming from the business environment. One key element in beyond budgeting is coherence. Coherence between what we preach on the left-hand side around leadership, what we practice on the right-hand side through our management processes. In a lot of organizations, you find a lack of coherence, right? One classical example, it doesn't help that we, on this side, talk loud and warm about how fantastic employees we have on board, and we would be nothing without you, and we trust you so much. But not that much. Of course, we need detailed travel budgets, right? This is hypocrisy. We are saying one thing here, we are doing the exact opposite on this side, and people notice. And the words become hollow because the management processes have the opposite message. And what we do always speaks 10 times louder than what we say. So this horizontal coherence is important. There are 2 other coherences we also talk about. The second one is what we call a vertical coherence, especially between the management processes. There are 2 functions in large organizations that typically decide a lot when it comes to the management processes. It's finance and it's human resources. These processes start out in finance territory, target setting, forecasting, resource allocation, move into human resource territory of performance evaluation and rewards. And there has to be a coherent, consistent message and philosophy behind. It doesn't help that kind of finance have a call it beyond budgeting philosophy in what they do here if HR has the exactly opposite in what they do here. So that is why we recommend finance and HR to work together in doing this. The last coherence we talk about is the external coherence. That's the coherence between the management model of an organization and its business environment. And I don't know if you've heard about something called Ashby's law. Ashby, he was a UK guy, a British guy, studying biological systems. And his simple law or theory is that the adaptability, the viability of a living organism must always exceed the dynamics and volatility of its environment. If not, the organism will die. And the same applies for organizations. So you need a coherence between your internal management model and the outside world, making sure that your adaptability is always bigger than the volatility you are facing. A number of companies are today on this journey in some form or shape, and I could talk for hours and hours and hours here about fantastic cases here. And this is the slide that it's the most busy slide in my presentation because I need to keep updating it all the time. Keep popping up new companies here. We don't have time to go into many cases here because simply 45 minutes isn't enough. And I want to share with you some stuff that you haven't heard before. So just an indication that something is happening. I'm still missing Indian companies on this list. I'm sure they exist. If you have heard of any, let me know. I would love to have them up here. There is a bias towards Europe. There's also still a somewhat bias towards Scandinavia, but there are many exciting companies outside of these areas. Chinese Agile, you've got Kyocera up there, a Japanese company. Just learned about the Japanese bank called Hiroshima Bank, going beyond budgeting. So stuff is happening all the time. All right, what I've been through so far, some of you might have heard before. Now I want to enter into some stuff that you haven't heard before. And let's go back to that separation slide, right? Separating the three budget purposes and then starting to improve each one. And the first one was target setting. Some improve the way they set targets by finding inspiration from football. Right? I have yet to hear about a football team saying that the ambition for next season is to score 35 goals and get 39 points. They don't think like that. They think, because those are budget goals. They think in terms of league tables, doing well against the other teams and hopefully better than everybody else. And that kind of relative thinking can also be applied quite often in organizations, in business. Again, back to the bank we just talked about. They have no absolute financial targets. The target is to perform better than the average of its competitors. And they have been doing so all the way back to 1972, by the way. But some companies go further. They don't have targets at all. And I think that's an interesting discussion, and I'd like to share a few reflections around that topic. First of all, we need to remember that a target is not the target. And what do I mean with that? What I mean is that what we really want is the best possible performance, given the circumstances, given all we know afterwards. Right? The best possible performance. And setting targets is just one way of achieving this, and not always the best. And by the way, when I talk about targets here, I mean very number-oriented targets, very detailed, 29.2, typically annual targets, set from above, cascaded throughout the organization. Those are the targets I'm challenging. There's a big difference between targets you set for yourself versus targets that are set upon you, where the purpose is punishment or reward. And we need to remember that when we set an annual target, what we actually are doing, we are sitting in the autumn the year before, and we are trying to describe what does good performance look like 12 months down the road. Right? That's what we are trying to do. But if there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fog, how on earth do we know what that number is? Right? It becomes a guess. But we have to decide, should it be 32, 28? Then it becomes 29.2. And that becomes the truth and the answer that everything shall be evaluated against. But if the main purpose of that target is to have something to evaluate performance against, at which point in time do we know best what good performance looks like? Is that upfront in the autumn through a guess? Or is it afterwards when we have arrived, when the fog is gone, the uncertainty is gone, we know what happened in the markets with competitors, with energy prices, and so on and so on and so on. Another thing to remember when it comes to targets is something that a guy called Goodhart expressed once. You might have heard about Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. What he's trying to say here is that if you use measurement for learning and improvement and so on, then that's fine. But when a target is set upon that measurement from above for punishment and reward, then something happens very often with that measurement, because then you stimulate that gaming and all the things that we don't need. And last but not least, you know, in organizations, when it's target setting time, finance and human resources, they would keep banging on that managers, you have to set yourself ambitious targets. That is the message kind of in the autumn. What's the implicit message afterwards when it's time to evaluate and reward performance? Well, then it's the opposite. While setting yourself an ambitious target, that was a stupid thing to do, because that just reduced the chance of hitting the target and getting the goodies that follow, right? So, inconsistency in performance evaluation. Before I move on, could someone give me that watch down there, because I need to keep an eye on my time here, and I forgot it, so. Thank you. Time flies. All right, I know that what most of you, or what most people wonder about when it comes to targets is how to manage cost without a traditional budget. So I want to share with you a few slides on that. I have probably shown these before, but I mean, this is where most of the questions are coming. And again, a little metaphor. Imagine an organization that requires access to fuel, gasoline, in order to produce, right? What would the best way be for this organization to be supplied with fuel or gasoline? Would it be to get a fixed number of fuel cans once a year on January 1? Or would it be to have access to a pipeline where you can consume more fuel if you produce more and vice versa? And that's my biggest leading question of today. I hope we can all agree that this is a better way, and this is more of the beyond budgeting way. Let me make it a bit more concrete. Whatever new processes we introduce here, they have to be built on a mindset of what we call cost consciousness, so that we are thinking about company money in the same way as we think about our private money. And that includes asking different questions than when we shall, in a budget world. Here the question is, well, you should do something, do I have a budget for it? If you have, it's okay. If you don't have, it's not okay. A bit simplified. We want to hear other questions, like you see on the right-hand side. This mindset is, for large organizations, necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. They need some processes on top of a cost-conscious mindset. In your private economy, this is all you need, and this is probably hopefully what you have, right? You don't need big processes on top, but big organizations have. For projects, investments, we recommend a very simple principle: let the bank be open all the time. The line should always be, have the opportunity to propose a project and ask for funding at any time. Whether you get a yes or no depends on how good is your project and can we afford it, as things look today. So for investments, projects, not that difficult. A bit more challenging for operating costs, but we have a menu of recommendations here as well. This is what we want to leave, the traditional detailed annual budget, right? Decided very early, very detailed from the top. We want more autonomy and flexibility. Here is one example, burn rate guiding. There's still a number in the range of 1,000, 1 million, 10, 100, whatever. Full autonomy within, big difference. But we can make it even more self-regulating. We can move from thinking in absolute numbers to thinking in relative numbers. Unit cost, right? It shouldn't cost more than €5 per unit to produce. You can spend more if you produce more, and vice versa. We can make it even more self-regulating. There's no €5 per unit constraint, but your euro per unit should be competitive versus peers. So if you end up spending 6, that's okay if they spend 7 or 8. but not if they spend 3 or 4, right? If you have internal profit centers with that fully control their own cost and income, if these units have a tough bottom line target, profit target, that's also a way of managing cost. And last but not least, an alternative which I often call nothing at all. No budget, no target. The only numbers we have here are actual cost numbers coming out of the accounting systems. And we monitor this through control charts or moving averages. If it looks okay, we do nothing. If it looks a bit strange, we take a look at it. And there might be very good reasons for things looking like this. But, and this is important, we might also come across teams, managers, who consciously or unconsciously abuse the trust that lies in this model. The further to the right, the more trust we are shown. And the only thing you know is that if you show trust in an organization, someone will abuse it. It will happen. That's not the issue. The issue is, how do we respond? The simple but wrong response to punish everybody because somebody did something wrong. That's the classical response. The right response is to deal firmly with those involved and let it have the necessary consequences. By the way, I guess some of you are staying at this hotel. Did you check what kind of clothing hangers they have at this hotel? It's not the one with a hook, right? It's the other one that you need to fumble into a hole that you can't see in that dark, right? Which one do you prefer? The one with a hook or the one that you have to fumble into the small hole? Well, I prefer the one with a hook. How come this hotel offers us something else? I think we all know it's a question with a few stolen hangers with a hook. And what was the response? To punish everybody because somebody did something wrong. Think about that. Anyway, the further to the right, the stronger we need to be on values and direction. And there are 2 additional guardrails that a lot of companies have in place already. Decision authorities, how big individual decisions can you make expressed in money before you have to go 1 level up? And the second one is spending guidelines. The company I used to work for before I left corporate life some years ago went beyond budgeting 20 years ago. No travel budgets. But there's a simple principle. If you fly in Europe, you fly coach. If you fly intercontinental, you can fly business. It has nothing to do with travel budgets. It just helps people to make decisions. All right, then I want to kind of change topic a little bit, just a short reflection on OKRs, objectives and key results. And what I'm going to say now is no criticism of OKRs, because I think there's a lot of good stuff with them, but I have a few buts. And of course, it all started with, it exploded with this book published in 2018, Measure What Matters, John Doerr. Even if the whole thing started back in many, many years earlier in Intel, as you might know. And typically there's an objective, something you want to achieve, and some key results. And this is actually an example from Intel back then, 1980. And many similarities with the beyond budgeting thinking. There's a translation through the organization and no top-down cascading. This is not an annual exercise, it's more frequent, transparent, everybody can see everybody else's OKRs, and low link to bonus. And from a beyond budgeting perspective, we would support all of that. But there are 2 things that we struggle a little bit with. First, there seems to be an assumption that everything can be measured and that everything that is measured should have a target. We would challenge that. The second challenge, John Doerr is writing in his book that there can be no holistic performance evaluation, no assessment afterwards. You just look at the numbers, you either hit it or you didn't. We would challenge that because one of the principles in beyond budgeting is a holistic evaluation. Afterwards, when you have measured and compared actual versus target or whatever, you have to take off the measurement glasses and look at what measurement didn't pick up. All the kind of hindsight insights that we have. The other thing is that most organizations having OKRs, they also have budgets. And that's an issue as well, because very often there will be a conflict between what the OKRs are telling you to do and what the budget is telling you to do. And who wins that conflict, do you think? Is it the OKRs or the budget? It's the budget. So what's the implicit or explicit message? Well, we have OKRs, but the budget really counts. So if you really want to succeed with OKRs, kick out the competition, kick out the budget. All right, let me finish with a few implementation advices. And, you know, there's a lot of kind of change formulas out there about how to get change in an organization. You've got Kotter's, this is 8 or 9 steps, and every big consulting company have their own methodology. What they all have in common is that it's very orderly, structured, sequential. First you do this, and then this, and then this, and in the end you get change. I don't believe that. Change is not kind of sequential. Change is messy. It's only when it feels a bit chaotic that you are really into change. So I'm very skeptical to those ones, but there is one I do like. Not because it's called the change formula, but it doesn't talk about steps. It talks about components that needs to be in place in order to get change. And to get change, the first thing you need is dissatisfaction. Right? Without dissatisfaction, no change. But that's not enough. You also need a vision that can ignite people about something much better. But that is not enough either, because that vision might feel like a wet dream. Right? So you also need some tangible first steps. And the product of the three, not the sum, but the product, needs to be bigger than the resistance. So if any of the three on the left-hand side is 0, close to 0, resistance will always win. And actually, I have been touching about all of these three today. I talked about budget problems to kind of increase your dissatisfaction. I talked about beyond budgeting principles as a vision. So some of you might feel like it's a wet dream. And I talked about the separation of the budget purposes as one way to get started. Okay. The other thing I want to share with you is something that's brand new. And that is why the title of this session is called Beyond Budgeting, the Viable Management Model. Viable, that is about, again, coming from biology. It's about kind of being adaptive and able to survive. And you might have heard about the business model canvas. Alex Osterwalder and his team, huge success. This book has sold, Business Model Generation has sold in buckets. It's a great book, but this book is about the business model of organizations. How do we as an organization interact with the outside world in order to create value? And that's important, but it's different from the management model of the organization, because that is how you organize work internally. And so far, there has not been a similar book on management models. But now there is one. It's called The Viable Map. It's a workbook. It's just out, and we took the liberty of kind of copying Alex Osterwald's kind of design ideas here. It's built around the beyond budgeting principles. This is where it starts out. The beyond budgeting principles, and then as first step, we simply stack them in a different way. And then we add on these two realities that we need to reflect on, the world out there and people in the organization. When it comes to the business environment, is it stable, is it volatile, or something in between? That's an assessment we need to do. Then we have the same talk about our employees, people. Where do we think most of them believe? Is it more on the theory X side, where they actually has to be controlled and managed and steered in a very different way than if you have most of your employees on the theory Y side? And your conclusions on these two, that again should give inspiration to your management model. Because if you have a business environment which is very, very volatile, you need extremely adaptive management models. Not that important if you operate in a stable business environment. And if you have the big majority of your employees is on the theory Y side, you need more kind of distributed, decentralized management models. If most of them is on the X side, you need more centralized management models, right? And then, having done this, and you make your reflection about where do we think we are here and here, then you can start to map your organization against the 12 beyond budgeting principles. Right, so this is the discussion that you have in the management team. It could be in the executive team, it could be in business unit teams, and so on. And this discussion is helping you to do a few different things. First of all, it helps us to have a structured discussion around what is a management model. Because without this framework, that can be quite a fussy discussion. People are more comfortable discussing business models than management models. This provides a framework. Then you can again discuss where are we on this axis here. You can use it to diagnose, are there any issues? Well, we seem to have two outliers here, one on autonomy and one on target setting. And you can use it to design a new and better management model. Now, a few important messages here. First, again, where you end up with your yellow stickers, well, that is a description of your current management model. And in having that discussion, what we call budgeting in this discussion is, think about this as broader than just budgets. It's the centralized command and control mode. Then everything over here on the left-hand side in red, that is what we call budgeting. Anything to the right of this red column, we call beyond budgeting. So it is not so that everything has to be all the way to the right here, because that depends on where's your business environment and what's your people do. But this is what we would generally recommend to get out of, the column to the left here. And another key discussion here is what's the internal vertical coherence here? That is a very important discussion. Because if you have some stuff lying out here, nice things you are saying on leadership, and then being very much on the left-hand side on your management processes, that is an issue. That is a lack of coherence. So the more coherent you are, the more viable you are. And then we provided some help on the management process side to place these stickers. This is the fixed column we talked about. If you start out with separating the budget purposes into target setting, forecasting, resource allocation, then you have decoupled. That's one step to the right. If you, in addition, do something with the rhythm, make it more continuous, that's another step. And if you also start to think football, comparing internally or externally with others, that's another step to the right. We don't have a similar guidance here on leadership. That is more of an assessment. But again, this is the viable management model. It's a great way for an organization to get started, not just to understand what beyond budgeting is, but also get started based on its own situation. So that's what I wanted to share with you. This was the very, very short version. Some of you might know that there is a longer version, which looks like this. Just a German translation out and a Spanish one underway. This book has a kind of normal book length, which for busy executives is often too long, too many pages. They are busy people. So my last book is a thinner one, more focused, aimed at busy people. That's why it's also out in an audio book. And I'm very happy that Professor Gary Hamel from London Business School, well, he's American, wrote the foreword. If you haven't heard about Gary Hamel, check him out. He is the #1 on management innovation globally. So that's what I wanted to share with you. Here are my coordinates. If anybody wants to follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn, highly appreciated. I only write about beyond budgeting. There are no cats and dogs and grandchildren, I promise. This is my own tiny website, and this is the website of the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable. It's a global network of organizations. If anybody is in London in May, we are running our meeting number 70 in London. And those of you who have heard about Dave Snowden and his complexity thinking, Knefe model, and he's going to be one of the keynote speakers. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Bjarte. Do we have time for one question, maybe?
Of course.
All right, any one? All right, right there. Let's go there.
Thank you, Bjarte. It's amazing to hear you. I heard you last in 2023, and this is my second time. Since then, I've been following quite a bit about budgeting. I completely agree with you. This is an exercise which is futile and waste, and it's not relevant after 3 months at the max. However, in my interaction, in my organization with the CXOs, there is one element which I fail to have an answer for. Which is for a public company, when the numbers and the predictions of the numbers matters, for a CEO to stand up and say that we target X percentage of profit, the control becomes an automatic part of budgeting. And without that kind of a forecast and a concrete forecast and a concrete, let's say, control on those numbers, the market will treat us ruthlessly. So how do you think in your experience, there are so many organizations you have worked with. Did you also face the same thing, and how it should be tackled?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and we get it a lot. The company I worked for before I left was one of Scandinavia's largest companies, listed in Norway and in New York. I think you're addressing two things. One thing is the quality of your forecast, what you think will happen, that you need internally to have a good understanding. That improves in Beyond Budgeting, because when you separate, you get much more quality. You get the gaming and the bias out of the forecasting. So internally, you have a much better absolute forecast of what you think will happen. The next question is, what kind of promises will you give to the market? And what Equinor did 20 years ago was to move from giving absolute promises on profitability to give relative promises. We said that we will perform better than the average of our competitors on two standard financial metrics, return on capital employed and shareholder return. And the market said, fine, go ahead and prove it. So I think it's one of these myths that the market always wants the absolute guiding. What they are after all, is good performance that can only be kind of proven through actual deliveries. Equinor has been able to hit that ambition most of the time, not always, but I think, the market is not stupid. What they want is to invest in companies that generally do better than the others in the same business. So that would be my response to that.
Thank you. So if I take this one point, which is that...
If you don't mind, if you can take, we
I understand.
need to make
Okay.
sure this
We can talk afterwards. So.